Today is Tuesday, the 16th of September, 2008. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And today it's my honor to have a conversation with Peter Goldsmith about your work at the Soybean Research, I should say the National Soybean Research Center here in Champaign. Or is it Urbana?
We are physically in Urbana.
Okay. Peter, why don't you tell me just a little bit about yourself and start with when and where you were born?
I was born in Stamford, Connecticut in 1959, and I'm probably one of the last people you'd expect to be executive director of the National Soybean Research Laboratory, having grown up about in Westchester County, New York, right outside New York City. And my mother worked in New York City. My father ran a manufacturing facility outside of New York City. And I knew nothing about agriculture growing up until my father retired and moved to a farm.
And how old were you when that happened?
I was 17. So I had never thought about agriculture, I liked being outdoors, of course, and that sort of thing, but camping and that sort of thing, but I had no idea. And they bought a farm, which they still live on, in western New Jersey. And I said, wow, gosh, I kind of like this. I started farming for people, and certainly didn't think about academics because I didn't start that until I was in my 30s.
What was your father's name?
Benioff. This is my stepfather who I grew up with.
Benioff?
Benioff, yep.
How would you spell that?
Benioff.
Okay. What nationality would that be?
Lithuanian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why did your father go to the farm?
My grandfather grew up on a farm in Delaware. There's a plaque on his farm because they were a group of emigres from New York City in the early 1900s when the ghettos, the Jewish ghettos of New York, were so teeming with people. And then they had this program of low-interest loans, and they moved people off to the farm. And so my grandfather's family was one of those, and they started farming in Delaware. And I don't know, maybe my father just got bitten by the farming bug like all of us do, and said when he retired, and he retired a fairly young man, said, I'm going to buy a farm.
Okay, you're 17-year-old. Had you graduated from high school yet?
It was right then. I just graduated. They waited till I graduated from high school.
What was your reaction when they moved to the farm? What do you think?
This is greatest. I was obviously like a pig in manure. Right? This was really good.
So you didn't miss all your friends or all the...
No. I was, no. I thought, we had a farm and it was in not very good shape, so we had a lot of work to do. And it's a hobby farm. It wasn't very big, very beautiful place. And it was great. And so we just, I spent that first summer helping them get it together, all the outside work, all the groundwork, and then started looking into programs on looking for neighbors where I could farm, where I could work, and just started farming for people.
I need to pause for just a second. Microphone's rubbing while you move your arm. I'm just going to fix that. That's nothing for you to worry about.
Did we miss some of it?
No.
Okay.
We didn't miss any of it, but I don't want the rubbing to get to be distracting.
And I'll start talking the second time around here again.
Okay, sure.
See, when you were talking before, you didn't move.
Yeah, most people know me to.
3, 2, 1.
Peter, can you describe the farm that your father purchased?
Yeah, it was a 50-acre farm in Mercer County, right on the border of Mercer and Hunterdon County, New Jersey. It had been a dairy, but the main barn had burned down in, I think, 1958. There was a couple-acre pond, rolling ground, not in the east, not very good ground, small, I don't know how many different fields, half a dozen small fields, corn, beans, hay, and is that good? And there was 3 tractors, 1 barn still standing, a employee's house, and then my folks' house.
Coming out of high school at the age of 17, what are your plans, the immediate plans?
I had thought I was going to be a lawyer, but I didn't really. I wasn't very. I was good in school. I was not very bookish. I liked working. That's what I always liked to do, was work. And so I went to a school out in Ohio, and that certainly helped. I went to a school called Kenyon College in Gambier, rural area, and I just liked being, out of the East Coast in rural area. And they had a library. This is before computers, and had a guest farmer program in Norway, and you could go and work all summer for a farm. I thought, well, that's great. What do I need to do that? And so I just signed away, and then signed up and started milking cows about 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, and farmed there, and made very good friends there, and said, yeah, dairying is really what I want to do. And so, well, there's more to it than that, but that was right out of high school.
What were you majoring in college?
I majored in political science, and Kenyon's a liberal arts college. And so I just took liberal arts and farmed during the summers and then on vacations, and worked the second year. I worked for a New Jersey farmer, a large cash grain and beef operation, and just driving tractors, plowing, all that sort of stuff for him. And third year out of college, or summer during college, and went back to the same farm. They liked me so much the first time, and went back there up in northern Norway and farmed for them. And they were expanding their farm, and so that was good. And then when I graduated, went back to Norway again. This time I'm fluent Norwegian, and it's not very difficult for me. And was a herdsman for a cooperative. That they had a law in Norway that all farmers had to take off 2 weeks a year. They had to physically leave the farm. And so then they needed guest herdsmen. So then I was a herdsman for them.
Did you graduate from college with a political science major?
Yep.
And yet you kept getting drawn back to the farm, sounds like.
Yep.
Anywhere in that process it says, I got the wrong major?
Well, not the wrong major, because I certainly, I don't know, the political philosophy has always been something of interest, but I didn't really want to. I knew nothing about graduate school. I wasn't thinking in anything like that. And but I did realize that I needed a dairy science degree. So then, when I came back from working as a herdsman, I enrolled at The Ohio State University, got a dairy science degree part-time. I was a herdsman for a farm in Ohio. So I started working for a farm in Ohio, and then during the middle of the day and winter, I'd take classes. So I do have a dairy science degree. So I came back and got that.
What year did you graduate from college?
1981.
And you're from Ohio State? From the Ohio State?
Yeah, Ohio State was 1983 maybe, with the dairy science degree.
Very briefly then, if you could talk us through from 1983 until the time you came to join this institution.
Well, I still didn't, I wanted to farm, so I farmed, graduated, farmed for a bit. We worked for this registered, it was a 90 cow registered Holstein herd in central Ohio. And then I decided to join the Peace Corps. And they had a large animal husbandry program in Ecuador. And there aren't many Aggies who know about cattle. So I was drawn to that, and they certainly selected me, and that was a great experience going down there. And there I worked for 2.5 years in Ecuador in the coastal region. It was a colonial region. It was an area that was being cleared, and taught artificial insemination, did a lot of country vet work, castrated every species, lots of horses, lots of pigs. And we set up an artificial insemination co-op because artificial insemination wasn't known at the time in Ecuador, and especially on the coastal region. And so we set up a co-op, managed a large herd there, and taught artificial insemination, reproductive management, and spent 2.5 years. I came back and got a job with Dairy Herd Improvement, which is a dairy records company that does dairy records, and then rose up and became the assistant general manager of that co-op, and got an MBA. Thought that might be helpful in finance. And then something happened. And then I was in my 30s, and something happened. I realized, I was really curious about co-ops. And I met a guy, an ag economist. I had no idea what an ag economist was. I'd never taken any economics. And I saw what he did, and people seemed very interested in what he did, not so much in dairy management, what I did, but more in the money. And so then I decided to leave Dairy Herd Improvement and became a graduate student, was offered an assistantship with a very nice gentleman, professor, and I started a new phase of my life as an economist, and had never taken economics before, and go right into a PhD class in economics. And
Where was this program?
at Ohio State.
Okay.
And so then I became a graduate student, and I worked, upon graduating, I was a professor at McGill University in Montreal, and then came here in the summer, the academic year 1999-2000.
Okay. I got to back up a little bit. You spent a lot of time overseas, in Norway, in Ecuador. What are those, first of all, what was the reason you joined the Peace Corps?
That's something I'd always wanted to do, and certainly influenced by my mother. She was very passionate in terms of activism and social responsibility, and I felt it was important to give back to society and so forth. And I had worked done a lot of volunteer work and in social organizations and as a kid, and I always wanted to do the Peace Corps. And it's just I do like to travel, and did like to travel, and thought it was the right thing to do.
What did you learn from all these overseas experiences?
Yeah, I don't know so much on Norway any life lessons, other than I certainly enjoyed it and so forth. But Ecuador was an important lesson in not only just in how the world works and our responsibility kind of to the greater good and the importance of that, and that every day a life is going on in so many other places of the world, and I was just very, very lucky to be plunked down in Westchester County, New York, not in country X and time Y, and it was just by chance, and not through good looks or anything else. It was just by chance, and that we really have, I felt, and still do, a great passion and responsibility for trying to do good and trying to improve the lives of others who are less fortunate.
Okay. Linda's told us quite a bit about this institution. What is your specific title here?
I'm the executive director of the National Soybean Research Laboratory.
Okay. And as the executive director, you're the chief full-time operating officer?
Right. But I'm a faculty member, so often faculty will have a small appointment, so there's an associate director who's the day-to-day, she's the real worker. I'm just kind of hovering around, causing trouble.
And she would be?
Bridget Owen.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
A board of directors then as well?
No, we don't have a board of directors. We work for the college. I work for the dean. And so Bob Easter is the gentleman who I report to, and we take our cues and direction from the college and the university.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your specific duties here then?
The National Soybean Research Laboratory is an organization that is geographically at the edge of the campus, and figuratively we are at the edge of the campus as well, and bridging relationships with industry and with faculty in terms of joint research and outreach, and so in soybeans. Mm-hmm. And so there is, for industry that seeks and looks to do soybean research on campus, we try to facilitate that, and we help anyone, any researcher who is looking to access grants, work with industry, help them in any way. We help them get their work out. We develop software to support their programs. Anything that supports research and outreach related to soybeans, from production genomics all the way through utilization and consumption.
Okay. Was there something specific about soybeans and soybean production that drew you to this particular institution?
In some sense, no. In some sense, yes. I do. My area of research is in industrial marketing, and global changes in grain and livestock markets, the agribusiness scene globally. One of the greatest phenomena in kind of postmodern agriculture is the rise of soybean production, not only throughout the world, but now most recently in South America. And so soy, it's as a supply of protein, it's supply of protein in low latitude regions and the equatorial regions, which is very unique because there's not a lot of protein in the low latitude regions, made it a very, very important subject to conduct research on.
I think you might have already gotten into it, and I have been told you're the person to ask this question to. Why soybeans versus corn, since we're right in the heart of the corn belt?
It's a good question. Well, they're both good, and as an economist, we think of them as complements. Increasingly, though, and maybe with the tone of the question, they may be what are called substitutes, meaning we might only need one crop, corn, or we might only need, in certain regions, one crop, soybeans. But I think that they do make them for very good complements, meaning that soybeans fix nitrogen, break up the disease cycle. Corn breaks up the disease cycle for soybeans. So the soybean crop does very, very well at following corn. So it makes for a very, very good rotation. Also, in terms of the industrial complex here in the United States, the meal is the finest protein source for livestock, and so we have a large poultry, swine, dairy, and cattle feeding complex in the country. And the oil, which is a byproduct, which is 17% of the bean, makes for a very good food ingredient. So it's in almost every processed food that we eat. So that complementarity has really been the backbone behind the livestock and food industry in the United States. So it's essentially been a perfect crop.
In the future, if you look forward in the future, do you see soybeans increasing the market share, or do you think it's pretty well, in terms of soybean versus corn, that's the leveling off point?
Right. I don't think it'll be increasing all that much. There is a stable, strong food industry and livestock industry in the U.S. Both are not going to grow very much. We're a very mature country in terms of development, and most of the growth in soybean demand will be overseas, and most of the supply will be produced overseas. Though we will see increases in yield, maybe not so much in acreage in the U.S.
Talk a little bit about what's going on in Brazil then, because I know you are very knowledgeable about that.
Yeah, Brazil is interesting for a number of reasons. First is certainly its expanse in terms of arable or productive farm ground. There is a lot of ground available. Much of the ground that we farm, and actually in the U.S. we're farming fewer acres than we did right after the war. So the new lands are really what are quite interesting, and a lot of those are in Brazil. That's certainly interesting. They also farm, especially in the center west, where most of my research is, in the state of Mato Grosso and in the center west region, is a region almost without history. So there isn't a history of farming there, a history of a land tenure. There isn't any sort of settlements or the government establishing farms there. So they don't have the history of small farms, relatively small farms that we do here or in Europe that were settled before mechanization. So these farms are all virgin farms, new farms being settled under a world of very sophisticated mechanization. So farms can be any size, and that's very interesting.
What's the land ownership patterns then?
So these are individual family farms. These are individuals. We happen to have one of our newest freshmen in the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics. His father is a farmer. Well, he owns 20,000 hectares in one state and another 20,000 hectares in another state. I mean, this is a very large landowner, but he's a single businessman. His father, who's now older, is part of the business, but the meaning of a family farm is so much different now when you can purchase land, and they're able to purchase it very cheaply. They're able to manage this farm, much larger farms than we're used to seeing here in the Midwest U.S. So it's a very interesting area. It's a very interesting phenomena, the farming model in the center west of Brazil.
Was this formerly rainforest?
No. And this is a complicated situation for us, for people who don't live in the region, to understand. But in some sense, I explain it as, if you're moving from Ohio, if you're driving from Ohio to Illinois, in eastern Ohio it'll be rolling, and everything will have, the original biome would have been forested. But as you start to move west, you'll find patches of prairie. And of course, as you continue to move west, you find greater percentage of prairie and less forested ground. And so here we would see forested ground in the riverbeds and low-lying areas. Well, the center west is much that way. There is a rainforest in the Amazon state and in the state of Mato Grosso in the northwest, and that's mostly rainforest, and by its name, it rains a lot, so it's not very good for crop agriculture. But the borderline, or the division of what is a rainforest and what is not clear, just like what is a prairie and what is not clear. There are patches. There's a biome called a dryland forest, and so there are trees, much like we had in the east that we cleared for agriculture in the eastern U.S. So there's dryland forest, and people confuse that with a rainforest. Mm-hmm. And then there's another biome, the largest one, it's called a cerrado. And this is a low brush, not a prairie, not a grass, but a very low brush that has very small trees and bushes and things like that, which makes up the majority of the land there. So it's complicated, because it's not like there's a rainforest and there's not a rainforest, and farmers are farming the rainforest. The rainforest is being cleared for timber. It's being cleared for livestock, because they can survive in a rainforest environment, much like where I worked in Ecuador. But cropping and soybeans need a dry period, and that's what the Cerrado region provides them, a long dry period where a rainforest can't grow.
Can you compare the soil in that Cerrado region with what we know here as that rich loam soil?
Yeah, it's very, very poor soil. It's much poor. It's very acidic soil, high in aluminum. It needs a lot of fertilizer. and so it's very expensive to manage. Lots of lime, and these are products, inputs that have to be brought into the region with no manufacturing in the region. So it's very expensive, but very necessary.
Is that why it had never been farmed previously?
No, it was. There's some great. I've been reading a lot of Brazilian history lately, and it was an area that had no infrastructure. So getting there is up until the 50s. There were not roads. Still today, the state of Mato Grosso is a third bigger than the state of Texas. There is no barge traffic. There is only 50 miles of railroad, and there is no four-lane highway. There is only a regular, state route, two-lane state route for the whole state. So all the soybeans, all the truck traffic has to go. All the traffic has to be trucked, and it has to go on these very small roads. So it's still a very difficult area to get around in.
I would think, though, that infrastructure is going to follow because the soybean fields are proving to be quite lucrative, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what, and people who have asked me over the years have asked about a particular highway that's supposed to, again, it would only be 2 lanes, but it would be paved, that would go from the state of Mato Grosso, which is in the interior of the country, to the ocean in the north, in a city called Santarém, where Cargill has a loading facility. Mm-hmm. But it hasn't been built yet. The federal government needs to set aside the funds to build the infrastructure. There is not enough, there's not mining activity going on there. There isn't enough wealth creation going on there to justify, for example, outside investment. There's been a lot of infrastructure investment, for example, by China in southern Africa because of the wealth that's sitting there. It's agriculturally very rich, but there has not been the commitment like we had with our federal highway system to link our rural communities or link their rural communities. That has not happened yet. And so you'll see in Brazil there's excellent infrastructure on in the east, on the coastal states. Have wonderful highways, lots of traffic, and then it'd be like at the Appalachians, they decide no more highways, the states have to fend for themselves, and there just has not been the dollars. The farmers build a lot of roads, but these are the private township roads. Mm-hmm. So it's infrastructure starved.
What can you tell? Do they have the kind of crop rotation that we would be familiar with here between corn and soybeans?
Well, it's a little bit different because they can farm year-round. So they will have, it's not a rotation but a succession, meaning that they'll plant soybeans in around October 1st, soon to start planting. And then they will harvest those soybeans in February, March, and come back and plant corn right away, no-till corn right in, and get a corn crop. And then they might have a green cover until after the corn is harvested. They have to keep a cover on because the soils are highly erodible. They're not pancake flat like ours are here. There is some slope to them, and so they have to keep cover on them. So no-till is something that they've embraced quite aggressively. Their corn yields are about half to less than half of our corn yields. Their bean yields are equal.
Again, we talked a little about how the practice growing soybeans throughout the world has evolved over the last few decades. I want you to tell us a little bit about the condition of the global market currently for soybeans, and what are some of the dynamics that underlie that?
Yeah, the market is like for all commodities, hard and soft, meaning grains and as well as metals and petroleum. Quite good, and as we were sitting here in September, commodity markets have started to soften a little bit as demand from the world economy has started to abate a bit. But the demand for soy is great because as incomes have risen, In the developing countries, consumers have shifted from grain diets to meat diets, and from fresh food diets to processed food diets, and that involves soy oil and soy meal for livestock feed. Poultry consumption is rising dramatically. Pork consumption is rising dramatically, and fish and seafood, which are increasingly fed soy meal, has risen dramatically. And so these are all very, very good omens for the industry. The demand for oil as well. There has been an increase in the demand for biofuels, and soy oil under certain conditions is a fine biofuel, but it has probably better use as a food oil. But oil has been taken up in the marketplace for biodiesel, and so the value of oil has risen dramatically, and both for fuel and because of fuel and food demand reasons. And so now the oil is very, very valuable, not just the meal. So it's a very good time.
Gosh, there's about 1 million different directions I'd like to go on here, but let's develop this issue of biodiesel a little bit more.
Yeah.
When you're making biodiesel, you also have the other byproduct.
Glycerin, yes.
But you also, and that, from what we've heard already, that's an excellent source for livestock feed. Is that correct?
Well, maybe you're confusing with ethanol and DDGs.
Well, I know there's a difference between biodiesel and ethanol, and that was
Right.
certainly one of the things I
So
wanted to pursue.
the byproduct issue with biodiesel is less of an issue, not really an issue, than it is with ethanol, where 1/3 of the product is the ethanol and 2/3, we wouldn't call them byproducts, or co-products, which is a livestock feed, DDGs, and CO2. In biodiesel, most of what we are able to produce is diesel fuel. The issue with using soybean oil or food oil for biodiesel is that it's expensive. And with soybeans, most of the soy is not an oil crop. It's a protein crop. So there isn't a lot of oil with in a soybean relative to sun or canola, jatropha. I mean, there are a lot of other oils out there, crops out there that produce higher levels of oil that could be used. But there's also great opportunities to produce biodiesel from waste oil, as well as animal fat and waste grease and things like that, so that it's a very, biodiesel can use a variety of feedstocks, not just soybean oil. So if you were to start a biodiesel, if you wanted to produce biodiesel just from some feedstock, you wouldn't necessarily choose a soybean, because you better have a place for the meal, because that's really what you're producing, is a lot